self-contained individualism. And it's characterized by razor-sharp distinction between self and non-self. Second, the other is outside the self and not in the self. And finally, the relationship between self and environment is one of control. The self, ideally, is in control of the environment. Self-contained individualism. Let's explore this a bit more deeper. I would now like to propose to have a short look the title is not visible. Okay. Yes, okay. Thank you. Yeah. I was seeing more than you saw. Right, so just very briefly, in order to go on, what are some of the main differences between the modern self, that was Peter Caliro's list, and the postmodern self? I want to warn you, I'm not a postmodernist, but I would like to learn from it, so that's my purpose. What can we learn from modern self, postmodern self, for deepening the dialogical self? Now, the modern notion of the self is, I already referred to the word of Samson, it's characterized by self-contained individualism. There is a centering self. So the self is centered. So when you imagine a circle, then the center is strong, keeps it together. So therefore you need centering movements. Yeah, this, I remember now there is this very well-known book by Bella on forms of individualism, particularly in America. And there are many, many, many examples. For example, Frank Sinatra, I do it my way. My way. Yeah, it's very interesting. When you come in the United States, like we came 2 days ago here in Boston, then you have a fresh mind. You see a lot of things that you do not see in your own country, particularly the first hours. And it's quite impressive when you look around, then in America, there's something, you don't see that in Europe. Here you are first, or you are the best. There is a statue somewhere here in the neighborhood about a person who did a lot for ending slavery, champion of the slaves. There was an advertisement of ambition is thirst, advertisement for Coca-Cola. And there is a lot of emphasis on this individualism, a kind of scale where you are the best, the first, the earliest, the strongest. There is an emphasis on hero, it's a hero culture. Europe too, but here it's more pronounced, it's very clearly pronounced. It's very understandable on the basis of the history of America. Yeah, there is, in the modern notion, no complicity in language, culture, and community. Of course, the self can be expressed in language. There is a culture and there is a community, but they are additional, they are surrounding the self. But the self is itself, it's not a linguistic, deeply linguistic entity. It's not cultural self. It's not in the community. It's not self itself a community. The self has its own grounds. In the literature you find, for example, self-sovereignty, self-sovereign. The self is self-sovereign. The self is its own ground. I'm the boss about myself. I determine myself. Notions like self-direction, self-control, emphasis on consistency and on agency. Then the postmodern notion, you see more emphasis on the decentering of the self. And one of the most famous statements is, of course, by the Irish poet William Yeats, who said, "Things fall apart, the center does not hold." This is quite beautiful because we have again this circle and the center. When the self is taken away, is drawn away to very different directions, it's very difficult for the center to hold. So the decentralizing forces, they become stronger than the centralizing forces. To such an extent that some of the most extreme representative of postmodernism, or related streams of thought, they say there is no agency. There is no agency in the self. So the self is part of communities, linguistic communities. Self itself is a linguistic construction. So history and language communities and changes in language communities become very important. There is an emphasis on multiplicity and on social power. This social power is interesting on the basis of the work of Michel Foucault. I read an interview with Michel Foucault, and he said somewhere, "Please don't ask me what is my identity and who I am, because I'm not a Frenchman, I'm not a left-wing person, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm even not an homosexual," which he in fact was. So he was very distrustful to fixed reality. He was very distrustful to progress. And he made a strong point on truth as a definition. Truth is always defined truth. And who is defining the truth? And the person or the institution who defines the truth, that's the person in power. And what we think which is truthful is often the result of power relationships. Well, what is then, how can we imagine the dialogical self? When I look at the literature of the past 20 years, this statement is most used in several publications. It's a dynamic multiplicity of I positions in the landscape of the mind. So it's dynamic, it's a multiplicity of I positions. Note there are positions, but also there are I positions in the landscape of the mind, the spatial aspect. And it's dynamic because there is positioning and counter-positioning. And of course, it has to be added, this mind is intrinsically connected with the other mind. So dialogical relationship cannot be separated from the idea that there is another person, even in the self, not outside the self, but in the self. The other as part of the self. As voice positions, they allow dialogical relationship both within and between people. So the self becomes a society of mind. As a correction to the self-contained identity as criticized by Sampson and others, there is this notion of the other becomes an intrinsic aspect of the self, the other in the self. So the otherness, the alter, in the sense of Aristotle, is in the self and gives a multiplicity where the self is beyond individualism, the purely centralized unity in itself. Dialogical relationships involve both interchange and relatively dominance and are placed in the context of power relationships. The point is when the relationship between people become too much in terms of power distances, the power differences are too big, there can be no dialogue. Dialogue has its constraints, because the dialogue can move into the direction of a monologue. So when there can be only dialogue, I think, when there is, there are two or more different positions that, in terms of interchange, receive the possibility to speak each from their own point of view without the one position subordinated to the other position. When one position is silenced by another position, then you see that the dialogical process moves into the direction of monologue. So dialogue is constrained. Particular positions are more dialogical than other positions. Yeah, well, now let's come to the first kind of summary. The dialogical self, is it a contradictory concept? As subjected to a multiplicity of positions, the self is discontinuous and subjected to decentering movements. But that's an influence and inspiration from the postmodern model. At the same time, as belonging to one and the same I positions, the positions belong to a continuous self that is engaged in centering movements, which is inspired by the modern self. Even when I'm totally reborn tomorrow morning, I feel the same self. So continuity and discontinuity go together. Unity and multiplicity are going together. The self is not just a product of social and societal relationships, but it's substantial and agentic enough to contribute to these relationships from its own original and